Vladimir Nabokov, Hurricane Lolita. Review of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov and the annotated Lolita edited by Alfred Appel, Jr. The Atlantic, December 2003. In Azar Nafisi's Reading Lolita in Tehran, in which young female students meet in secret with Xerox copies of Nabokov's masterpiece on their often chaste and recently chadored laps, it is at first a surprise to discover how unscandalized the women are. Without exception, it turns out they concur with Vera Nabokov in finding that the chief elements of the story are its beauty and pathos. They identify with Lolita because they can see that she wants above all to be a normal girl child. They see straight through Humbert because he's always blaming his victim and claiming that it was she who seduced him. And this perspective, such a bracing change from our conventional worried emphasis on paedophilia, is perhaps more easily come by in a state where virgins are raped before execution because the Quran forbids the execution of virgins, where the censor cuts Ophelia out of the Russian movie version of Hamlet, where any move that a woman makes can be construed as lascivious and inciting, where goatish old men can be gifted with infant brides, and where the age of consent is more like 9. As Nafisi phrases it, this was the story of a 12-year-old girl who had nowhere to go. Humbert had tried to turn her into his fantasy, into his dead love, and he had destroyed her. The desperate truth of Lolita's story is not the rape of a 12-year-old by a dirty old man, but the confiscation of one individual's life by another. We don't know what Lolita would have become if Humbert had not engulfed her. Yet the novel, the finished work, is hopeful, beautiful even, a defence not just of beauty but of life. Warming up and suddenly inspired, I added that in fact Nabokov had taken revenge on our own solipsizers. He had taken revenge on the Ayatollah Khomeini. It's extraordinary to think that the author of those anti-tyrannical classics, Ben Sinister, An Invitation to a Beheading, who would surely have felt extreme pleasure at this tribute, can be posthumously granted such an unexpected, yet, when you reflect on it, perfectly intelligible homage. In his own essay on the fate of Lolita, Nabokov recalled a publisher who warned him that if he helped the author to get it into print, they would both go straight to jail. And one of the many, many pleasures of Alfred Appel's masterly introduction and annotation is the discovery that Nabokov did not realize that Maurice Sherodius and the Olympia Press were specialists in, well, shall we just say, erotica, when he let them have the manuscript. The shock and awe surrounding its publication were later well netted by the great lepidopterist in one of John Shade's cantos in Pale Fire. It was a year of tempests, hurricane. Lolita swept from Florida to Maine. Innocence of that kind is to be treasured. And innocence, of course, is the problem to begin with. If Dolores Haze, whose first name means suffering and grief, that dolorous and hazy darling, had not been an innocent, there would be nothing tragic in the tale. Azar Nafisi is someone who, in spite of her acuity and empathy, fails what I call the Martin Amis test. Amis once admitted that he had read the novel carefully before noticing that in its foreword, written not by the unreliable Humbert, but by John Ray Jr., Ph.D., we learn that Lolita has died in childbirth. She's over before she's begun. That's where the yearning search for a normal life and a stable marriage got her. I fear that the young ladies of Tehran missed that crucial, callous post-date update sentence as well. Then we must approach the question of how innocent we are in all this. Humbert writes without the smallest intention of titillating his audience. The whole narrative is, after all, his extended jailhouse, madhouse plea to an unseen jury. He has nothing but disgust for the really pornographic debauchee Quilty, for whose murder he is being confined. But he does refer to him as a brother, and at one point addresses us too as reader, brooder, which is presumably designed to make one think of Baudelaire's address of Les Fleurs du Mal to hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. I once read of an interview given by Roman Polanski in which he described listening to a lurid radio account of his offence, even as he was fleeing to the airport. He suddenly realized the trouble he was in, he said, when he came to appreciate that he had done something for which a lot of people would furiously envy him. Hamlet refers to Ophelia as a nymph. Nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. But she is of marriageable age, whereas a nymphette is another thing altogether. Actually, it's impossible to think of employing Lolita for immoral or unsavoury purposes, and there is now a great general determination to approach the whole book in an unfussed, grown-up, broad-minded spirit. "Do not misunderstand me," said Amos Pear when he reviewed the first edition, "if I say that one of the troubles with Lolita is that, so far from being too pornographic, it is not pornographic enough." When he wrote that, his daughter Sally was a babe in arms, and now even those innocuous words seem fraught with implication. This doesn't necessarily alter the case, but neither can I forget Sally's older brother, who wrote, "Parents and guardians of 12-year-old girls will have noticed that their wards have a tendency to be difficult. They may take Humbert's word for it that things are much more difficult, are in fact entirely impossible, when your 12-year-old girl is also your 12-year-old girlfriend. The next time that you go out with your daughter, imagine you are going out with your daughter." When I first read this novel, I had not had the experience of having a 12-year-old daughter. I have had that experience twice since, which is many times fewer than I have read the novel. I dare say I chortled in an outraged sort of way when I first read how sweet it was to bring that coffee to her and then deny it until she had done her morning duty. But this latest time, I found myself almost congealed with shock. What about the fatherly visit to the schoolroom, for example, where Humbert is allowed the privilege of sitting near his wife's daughter in class? I unbuttoned my overcoat, and for 65 cents, plus the permission to participate in the school play, had Dolly put her inky, chalky, red-knuckled hand under the desk. Oh, stupid and reckless of me, no doubt, but after the torture I had been subjected to, I simply had to take advantage of a combination that I knew would never occur again. Or this, when the child runs a high fever. She was shaking from head to toe. She complained of a painful stiffness in the upper vertebrae, and I thought of poliomyelitis, as any American parent would, giving up all hope of intercourse. Forgive me, hypocrite lecteur, if I say that I still laughed out loud at the deadpan way in which Nabokov exploded that landmine underneath me. And of course, as Amos Fies half admits in his words about parents and guardians, Lolita is not Humbert's daughter. If she were, the book probably would have been burned by the hangman and its author's right hand sliced off and fed to the flames. But just as Humbert's mind is on a permanent knife edge of sexual mania, so his creator manages to tread the vertiginous path between incest, by which few are tempted, and engagement with pupating or nymph-like girls which will not lose its frisson. You will excuse me if, like Humbert, I dissolve into French when euphemism is required. For me, the funniest line in the book, because it is so farcical, comes in the moment after the first motel rape, when the frenzied Humbert, who has assumed at least the authority and disguise of fatherhood, is forced to devote a dangerous amount of time, was she up to something downstairs, to arranging the bed in such a way as to suggest the abandoned nest of a restless father and his tomboy daughter, instead of an ex-convict saturnalia with a couple of fat old whores. None of this absurdity allows us to forget, and Humbert himself does not allow us to forget, that immediately following each and every one of the hundreds of subsequent rapes, the little girl weeps for quite a long time. How complicit, then, is Nabokov himself? The common joking phrase among adult men when they see nymphets on the street or in the park or nowadays on television and in bars is, "Don't even think about it." But it is very clear that Nabokov did think about it, and had thought about it a lot. An earlier novella, written in Russian and published only after his death, The Enchanter, centres on a jeweller who hangs around playgrounds and forces himself into gruesome sex and marriage with a Vashch-like mother, all for the sake of witnessing her death and then possessing and enjoying her 12-year-old daughter. I note one correspondence I had overlooked before. The hapless old bag in The Enchanter bears many unappetizing scars from the surgeon's knife, and when Humbert scans Lolita's statistics, height, weight, thigh measurements, IQ and so forth, he discovers that she still has her appendix, and says to himself, "Thank God." You don't want to think about that for very long either. And then there is, just once, a hint of incest so elaborate and so deranged that you can read past it, as many critics have, before going back and whistling with alarm. The thought that with patience and luck I might have her produce eventually a nymphette with my blood in her exquisite veins, a Lolita II, who would be 8 or 9 around 1960, when I would still be dans la force d'âge. Indeed, the telescopy of my mind or unmind was strong enough to distinguish in the remoteness of time a vieillard encore vert, or was it green rot, bizarre, tender, salivating Dr. Humbert, practising on supremely lovely Lolita III, the art of being a grandad. Arresting as well as disgusting to suddenly notice that Lolita, who died giving birth to a stillborn girl for Christ's sake, would have been 70 this year. However, I increasingly think that Nabokov's celebrated and tiresomely repeated detestation of Sigmund Freud must itself be intended as some kind of acknowledgement. If he thought the Viennese quack and Freudian voodooism were so useless and banal, why couldn't he stay off the subject or the subtext? I could very well do with a little rest in this subdued, frightened-to-death rocking chair before I drove to wherever the beast's lair was, and then pulled the pistol's foreskin back and then enjoyed the orgasm of the crushed trigger. I was always a good little follower of the Viennese medicine man. Many a true word is spoken in jest, especially about the kinship between Eros and Thanatos. The two closest glimpses Humbert gives us of his own self-hatred are not without their death wish, made explicit in the closing paragraphs, and their excremental aspects. I am lanky, big-boned, woolly-chested Humbert Humbert, with thick black eyebrows and a queer accent, and a cesspool of rotting monsters behind his slow, boyish smile. 200 pages later, the turquoise-blue swimming pool some distance behind the lawn was no longer behind that lawn, but within my thorax, and my organs swam in it like excrements in the blue sea-water in Nice. And then there's the offhand aside. Since, as the psychotherapist as well as the rapist will tell you, the limits and rules of such girlish games are fluid, in which it takes a moment to notice that the therapist and the rapist are in direct opposition. Once you start to take a shy hand in the endless game of decoding the puns and allusions and multiple entendres, the Umberto echoes, if I may be allowed, that give this novel its place next to Ulysses, you are almost compelled to agree with Freud that the unconscious never lies. Swinburne's poem Dolores sees a young lady, our Lady of Pain, put through rather more than young Miss Haze. Lord Byron's many lubricities are never far away. In the initial stages of his demented scheme, Humbert quotes from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. To hold thee lightly on a gentle knee, and print on thine soft cheek a parent's kiss. And when we look up the lines, we find they are addressed to Harold's absent daughter, who, like Byron's child and Nabokov's longest fiction, is named Ada. Humbert's first lost girlfriend, Annabel, is perhaps not unrelated to Byron's first wife, Anne Isabella, who was known as Annabella, and she has parents named Lee, just like Byron's ravished half-sister Augusta. The Haze family physician who gives Humbert the sleeping pills with which he drugs Lolita preparatory to the first rape at the Enchanted Hunters Hotel is named Dr. Byron. And while we're on the subject of physicians, remember how Humbert is recommended to an excellent dentist? Our neighbour, in fact, Dr. Quilty. Uncle or cousin, I think, of the playwright. Think it will pass? Well, just as you wish. In the fall, I shall have him brace her, as my mother used to say. It may curb Low a little. Another Quilty with his own distinctive hint of sadism. Sage Justine was 12 at the start, as Humbert reflects, those three so ordinary words, at the start, packing a huge, even gross potential weight. These clues are offset by more innocuous puns. We had breakfast in the township of Soda, Pop 1001. And by dress rehearsals for puns, as when Humbert decides to decline a possible joke about the Mann Act, which forbids the interstate transport of girls for immoral purposes. Alexander Dolonin has recently produced a fascinating article on the contemporaneous abduction of a girl named Sally Horner, traces of the reportage of which are to be found throughout Lolita. All is apparently redeemed, of course, by the atrocious punishment that Nabokov inflicts for this most heinous of humanity's offences. The molester in The Enchanter was hit by a truck, and Humbert dies so many little deaths, eroding his heart muscles most pitifully, that in some well-wrought passages we almost catch ourselves feeling sorry for him. But the urge to punish a crime, "Why dost thou lash that whore?" Shakespeare makes us ask ourselves in King Lear, is sometimes connected to the urge to commit it. Naming a girls' school for Beardsley must have taken a good deal of reflection, with more say than Lewis Carroll in it. But perhaps there is an almost inaudible note of redemption at Humbert and Lolita's last meeting, the only time, as he ruefully minutes, that she ever calls him honey. When I looked and looked at her, I knew as clearly as I know I am to die, that I loved her more than anything I had ever seen or imagined on earth, or hoped for anywhere else. The most unsettling suggestion of all must be the latent idea that nymphetomania is, as well as a form of sex, a form of love. Alfred Appel's most sage advice is to make yourself slow down when reading Lolita, not to be too swiftly ravished and caught up. Follow this counsel, and you will find that, more than almost any other novel of our time, it keeps the promise of genius and never presents itself as the same story twice. I mention the relatively obvious way in which it strikes one differently according to one's age, and if aging isn't a theme here with its connotation of death and extinction, then I don't know what is. But there are other ways in which Lolita is, to annex Nabokov's word, telescopic. Looking back on it, he cited a critic who suggested that Lolita was the record of my love affair with the romantic novel, and continued, "The substitution English language for romantic novel would make this elegant formula more correct." That's profoundly true, and constitutes the most strenuous test of the romantic idea that worshipful time will forgive all those who love and who live by language. After half a century, this work's transgressiveness makes every usage of that term in our etiolated English departments seem stale, pallid, and domesticated.